started exactly at 2, which it is, and so I think we should. It looks like folks are able to Zoom in. Looks like small folks from the College of Western Idaho just joined us. So we're all waving. So let's do a very fast introductory round because I know many of you don't know each other. And so very quickly, I'm going to just work on my screen up and down. So let's start with Rachel.
Hi, what do you want me to say? So
who you are, where you are, and what cohort you were part of.
Great. I was part of the cohort that just came down from UAA, and I'm an assistant professor of biology at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and we're happy about the snow. We're pretty excited that we're staying on the ground, and skiing is awesome up here. So.
All right, thank you. And so moving down, Rachel, Jason and Melissa.
I'm Jason Duncan.
I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Jason Duncan, Willamette University, and a member of cohort 3.
Also Willamette University.
Bill?
I'm Bill Davis. I'm one of the Northwest Pulse Fellows, so I've been in all 4 cohorts somehow, some way, and I'm at Washington State University.
Okay, Stas?
Stas Torres, Willamette University, and I'm on the steering committee this is the 4th year in a row, and that's all I do.
All right, well, I was just about to ask Nicole to introduce herself, but I'll wait till she comes back. Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy Ahern-Rindell at the University of Portland. I'm actually filling in for Jackie Van Humissen, and I think we had a cohort of 3 faculty who came.
I think you were in the second round. Okay, folks, College of Western Idaho, we can't see very well, but we hope we can hear you.
Can you hear us okay, Gary?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'm Nicole.
And I'm Willard.
Yeah, I think we might have a few others joining us. The biology department was part of cohort 2, and what else are you saying? Who knows it? Okay, and Willard's from physical sciences.
All right, welcome, Jenny. And then Joanne.
Jenny McFarland, Edmonds Community College. I'm one of the Pulse Fellows.
Joanne Otto, Western Washington University, and I'm one of the Pulse Fellows.
Carol?
Carol Pollock, University of British Columbia. I'm not a Pulse Fellow, but I've been privileged to be part of the steering committee for all 4 cohorts.
I'm Gary Reines. I've retired from Lewis and Clark College about halfway through this project, but I'm a Pulse Fellow and I've been part of all the cohorts. Pam?
Hi, Pamela Pape Lindstrom, Everett Community College. I'm one of the Pulse Fellows.
Yep. Okay, Marie?
Oh, Marie Gabbard, College of Western Idaho. Same cohort as Nicole. I guess that was 2 or 3. I'm not sure. Anyway.
2. We all.
Okay, thanks.
Victory. Okay, Wally?
Wally Schreiner, Mount Hood Community College, and I believe we were in cohort 2.
I think that's right. Maybe 3. Erica?
Erica Offerdahl, Washington State University Pulse Fellow.
Okay, and Steve.
I'm Steve Byers. I'm in Olympia, Washington, and I've been part of the consulting team that's helped facilitate the workshops for the last 3 years.
Okay, good. And I'm hoping we'll have a couple more folks join us, but
I'm from Whitman College.
Oops. Sorry, Ariel.
And Brianna.
You weren't on my screen. Yeah, I'm Brianna. Hi. You introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Brianna Lind. I'm at Willamette, and so I'm the cohort with Jason and Melissa. I'm just in a different office.
Okay, good. Okay, so we started talking about dynamic governance a little bit at the third cohort. So if you were earlier, you might not have heard about it. And so we thought it would be useful to go into it in a little bit more detail and give folks a chance to ask questions. And at least a couple of the groups here, I think, have tried it out, and as have Erica and Carol in different contexts. So you might want to hear about ways in which it can be used. So I think, Pam, you're on to introduce us.
Hi, I'm going to just do a quick overview, and I'm going to share my screen, and you will see a couple of slides that we used at our most recent meeting. So this is just an overview of dynamic governance. 3 main aspects. So the first is that it has something called double linking. So we have circles, which you might be teams or departments in a college situation. And in Pulse, the circles are organized around the projects. And the double linking means that the delegate and the leader of each circle report up to the next circle. And I'll show you a diagram in a minute that makes that make a little bit more sense. The other main point about dynamic governance is that there's decision-making by consent. It's not the same as consensus. Not everyone has to agree, but you have to say that you don't have something called a paramount objection. So essentially, if the work that's being proposed is in line with the aims of the circle or the team or the department, then you agree to let the proposal move forward. The important part about that is that there's usually a time frame. So if people aren't happy with all the aspects of a decision, you can say, okay, we're going to do it this way for the next 6 months, or for the next 12 months, or for the next academic year, whatever might make sense for your specific situation. And then the key here is the third element in this little circle here, the feedback loops. So all the policies have a time frames and evaluation criteria. And so that's the important part, is to really come back and close your loop. So if you say we're going to do something in a specific manner for a certain period of time, then you have to make sure that when that year's up, you're coming back and you're reevaluating whatever the decision was. A circle member can request evaluation sooner than the consented time frame if they think it's necessary or useful. So those are essentially the 3 major elements of dynamic governance. Here's an example of our current Pulse structure. And essentially, this is just here as an example of what double linking means. So for example, I'm the leader of recognition, and Marcy Kelly is the delegate. And so we both belong to the next circle up, which is the products and services circle. And then there's 1 leader and 1 delegate from that circle that comprises the Fellows Council. We've modified the format a little bit with assessment. That's why the lines are dotted here. I'm not going to really talk a lot about that. But the double linking is important because it allows for information flow both up and down the organization. And it's important to have 2 people because, not every single person makes it to every meeting. And also that just ensures that all of the ideas are being brought forward. So there's sort of 2 people to report up and down, so that you have all of the information hopefully flowing in a non-biased manner. So this is the first half of the cheat sheet that Gary sent to you on your email, and this is essentially the procedures you would follow when you're coming up with a new idea, when you're generating a new proposal. So there's picture forming, which most of us are familiar with. A similar term is something like brainstorming. So you picture form, you get all your ideas out on the table. Then you can consent to the completeness of the list. Then you can do rounds. So a round is where every single person in the group gets to express their opinion. And, you check in with them and say, what would you like to add? You go, so it's a formal way of going around the room and making sure that all of the voices are heard. Generally, that's enough to get everything out on the table. Sometimes if you have a really complex idea, you might use tuners. Honestly, we don't use tuners a lot. I mean, we do it as a process, but we don't necessarily formally identify who's the tuner and who's not. So a lot of this work is accomplished by the facilitator of the meeting. So each circle has a leader and a delegate, as I've mentioned, and there's also generally a facilitator and a secretary. Once the proposal's presented, and this doesn't all necessarily happen in the same meeting. A lot of times you go away and write your proposal up and then bring it forward to the larger group. But when you present the proposal, it's important to just do a round of clarifying questions. And this is important. You're not asking for people whether they like your proposal or not. You're just trying to make sure they understand your proposal. So that you do a round of clarifying questions. And after that, then you do a round of quick reactions. So this is when people get to share their opinion. And then, assuming everyone's opinions are favorable, then you might move forward to a consent round. If there's, real concerns expressed during the quick reactions phase, then you might table the process and come back at your next meeting, so on and so forth. And then once you do have everyone consent, meaning that no one has a paramount objection, then you get to clap. And you can see that it's an iterative process here. Options for moving the proposal forward, sort of like, the scientific method. You do one set of experiments, they don't always work out, you go back and repeat. It's the same iterative process. So that was sort of a very quick introduction. And if anyone has questions, any questions for the information that I just presented there? Okay, so I'm gonna turn it back to you.
Sorry.
Oh,
I have a question.
Boss.
The whole process you described is designed to bring people to the table to discuss a particular topic. And the question I have is, how do we get people to understand that this topic needs to be discussed? In other words, before we even get to how we're going to carry this discussion, it's that this is an issue. What are the kinds of arguments we would need to bring in advance to make sure that everybody comes prepared to have this discussion?
Well, so you start everything off with the picture forming process. Generally, so before you have a formal proposal. So I would say that in terms of motivating people to even have the discussion, that is something, you would have to say to the group, well, this is a need that I see. If you're in a group of people and you're perhaps the only person who wants to discuss it, it does not necessarily always go forward, right? So it is a group process. I mean, certainly the leader, so the people who set the agenda for the meetings are typically the leader, the delegate, the secretary, and the facilitator. It varies a little bit by the circle who's actually creating the agenda. A lot of the times it's whoever has time that week to create the agenda. We do most of our agenda creation via email. So usually 3 or 4 days before there's a meeting, sometimes it's the leader, sometimes it's a secretary, sends out an email and says, hey, these are the agenda items that we have. So I guess in our group, Pulse, we really are motivated by the aims of each specific team or circle, and we don't usually disagree about what we need to talk about next. Our issue has typically been that we have too many things to discuss and we're limited by the time that we meet, and so we will sort of prioritize which agenda items will come forward for each meeting. So it is a little bit different than a department. In my own department, one of the things I've used to kind of circumvent the issue I think that you're suggesting, Stas, is at the beginning in the fall, we meet every 2 weeks. And I try to get people to at least put sort of two big items on the agenda for each meeting, because they like to just cancel the meeting. And if there's no preset events, they're like, oh, we don't need to meet. When actually there are things we have to discuss. And then we get to the end of the quarter and it's like, we didn't do stuff we needed to get done. So I think that how you proceed with that might vary depending on your specific situation. But it has not been a problem for us. Any other questions that people have? Okay.
Thank you, Pam. We had a couple of people just join us, so I wonder, Jim, if you could introduce yourself and Maya. First, Jim.
Hi, I'm Maya from the College of Western Idaho.
Oh, thanks. Maybe I got your name wrong. Who's with Ariel?
Yeah, this is, I didn't realize we were talking about that.
College. I thought I was already introduced.
All right, thanks. Welcome. Next, we've had our poster group from last year's session from Willamette who actually went home and tried to implement dynamic governance there in their department. We've asked them to talk a little bit about how that's worked out for them over the last year. So, Jason?
Can everyone hear me? Okay, so Melissa and I are going to talk about how we brought components of dynamic governance back to Willamette University to facilitate our department meetings in the Department of Biology here. We're going to present it in sort of two phases, the dynamic governance era, and I'll talk about that a little bit, and put it into context, and then Melissa will deal with the post-dynamic governance era. So the Department of Biology at Willamette University is comprised of approximately 10 faculty and staff members. We're all well-intentioned and collegial, but during our department meetings, we just couldn't get any traction on accomplishing things. So the poster title at our Pulse conference was All Vision, No Change, which is what we were. We had departmental level ideas that everyone generally agreed were good, but small differences in opinions about subtle details would stall us and lead us to no decisions being made, and we'd always revert to status quo, which was frustrating. Our mindset at the time was that every decision or change or idea that we came up with needed uniform and complete enthusiasm among the groups, which never happens. So it became clear what our problem was. Our focus on consensus in decision-making was collegial, but it was ineffective. Some voices in our department meetings were overrepresented, others underrepresented. There were lots of closed-door, informal pre-meetings that happened before our meetings actually happened. And consequently, things were not always inclusive or transparent. Was that it introduced a formality of process, which we were desperately lacking. And I like to refer to this as rules for our playground. Like our playground finally had these formal rules that everybody agreed to follow. It was a way to make progress on projects that were taking shape and nearly finished, but that we just couldn't achieve that activation energy to actually complete. And the prospect, I think it was agreed upon by every member that this sounded like a great idea, really thirsty to have this formality, because we could see that it was a prospect for better and more equitable communication to actually get things done. And then what it did was the possibility of focusing on common ground issues and big ideas before we ended up getting lost in the minutia of the details that would typically derail anything that we ever brought to the table as a group. So that's where we were before dynamic governance. And
so then at the Pulse Cohort 3 meeting last fall, we learned about the dynamic governance process, and so we brought it back and brought it to our department on a trial basis. It was our first decision we made using the dynamic governance, was to adopt this process for the duration of the rest of the semester, which was just a couple of months. And some of the things that we noticed right away were that everyone's got to speak, but nobody spoke too much. So that sort of addressed one of our very critical problems of the over and underrepresented speakers. We found that the discussion really stayed on topic a lot better. We had this previous chance to derail all the time, and it was important ideas, but they weren't on topic. And I think the sort of slightly unexpected, but really bonus was that everybody's listening really improved, because you know you're going to get your turn and you know when your turn is coming. So it behooves everyone to listen to those that go before, because there is this sort of expectation that you respond to what people have said, but not repeat what people have said. And so it helped things move along much faster. Our meetings got shorter when we started doing this. And it reduced the stress, especially for the quiet members, of finding that exact right moment to insert your comment, because you know when your turn is coming. So that helped with the underrepresented voices. The other thing that was really good for us was the built-in accountability, and the fact that if you did have a real objection, it's on you to help come up with the solution. And so it stopped people for objecting just out of a base of, I'm scared of this, but I don't have a better idea. And it also helped us with the realization that inaction is not an option, that the status quo is an active decision, so that it really allowed proposals to get approved or to reach consent. And that a proposal can be modified and approved later in the meeting or later on a timeline to be determined. But again, inaction wasn't an option. And if the status quo was really still the best option on the table still, then that was something that still had to reach consent. So it kind of got us out of the mud with a lot of decisions. And the other thing that was really helpful for us was that because every proposal requires that revisit date, a lot of people got more comfortable with the willingness to agree or consent to an idea that they weren't 100% enthusiastic about. There was that comfort with, well, if I don't like it, at least we're going to see this happen or revisit it again. And so it really helped people get comfortable with the idea of change. What we found is that we run into a few limitations that are primarily based on the fact that from this handout, we really started only with the decision-making strategy. So we started at step 7A because we had all of these unfinished projects that were nearly complete. We'd effectively gone through the proposal development process. So now that we've gotten to the place where we're kind of done with all of our existing proposals, we're finding that we really need to go back and revisit and learn how to do the producing proposals part of the process. Because we've gotten ourselves really stuck trying to develop proposals in the decision-making mechanism, and it does not work. So we're still looking for a really good mechanism for dealing with the small changes, the friendly amendments, and how to actually invoke the cycles that still allow us to make timely decisions. And we still haven't developed good procedures for holding individuals accountable after a paramount objection and expecting their return proposal. So I think those are some other places that we still have areas for growth. And I think that the other place that we've really found a big challenge is that when we have critical deadlines that are on short timelines. So we need to make a decision, but we don't have time to really go through as many rounds that we might like because there's a really imminent deadline coming up. So those are a few of the limitations that we're still struggling with. I think that about covers it.
Good. Thanks very much. Do folks have questions for the Jason and Melissa?
how did you talk to your department about it initially? My concern here being that it could sound like corporate language or something being imposed on a willfully independent department, etc.
Well, I think that when we brought it forward, there was almost, I would say, there was unanimous agreement, almost relief that this actually existed, because nobody really objected to it. They liked this idea of the formality of process. Like I said, it was almost as if there was a thirst for this. You know what I mean? There was no one really resisting this. I think each of us saw that this was a process that could get us, you know, over these humps that were impeding our growth.
And I would have to say that I think that thirst really stemmed for the fact that for the entire time that I've been in the department, so at this time it was a little over 4 years, and I know prior to that, the department had been stuck and we'd been having the same conversations with tiny iterations for years. And so I think that I think people were really ready to figure out a way to make those decisions. We've tried to talk to other departments about it and encourage them to use it, and they're a lot more reluctant. They don't see that they have problems. And so, yes and no. I don't know.
Thanks.
Anybody else have a question? Yes, Doss.
For the benefit of the group, could you revisit a little bit the situation that existed before you implemented dynamic governance and talk about the issues that existed there and how and whether they have been resolved? In other words, you adopted a new way of talking to each other, all the issues that prevented the progress before, what led to those situations to exist, and have they been resolved? In other words, did your new method of communication resolve any of the other administrative issues in the department?
So I would say that I would say that in the past we've been in situations where if somebody felt even a little bit uncomfortable with a proposal for some reason or another, that they could derail the entire process. And by bringing dynamic governance in, there was now sort of an accountability built in. Okay, we understand your discomfort with this, and you have exhibited a paramount objection to this. You are now accountable for coming up with an alternative to what was proposed, or improving it the way that that you would like to see it, and bringing it back to the group so that we can go through this process again. So because of that accountability, suddenly people would start to think seriously about whether they had a truly paramount objection, or whether this was something I'm not particularly thrilled with, but I can live with this. And so that line became more concrete.
I think it moved it. It moved the line too. So sort of the level of discomfort or concern over a problem, a perceived problem, had to be pretty serious for people to stand in the way anymore. So I think that helped a lot. I think also the other thing about everybody listening, and the focusing on the big ideas and the common ground first, it turns out most of our problems were in little details, and we'd be talking at parallel, but just couldn't quite find the intersection. And by focusing on the big ideas first, that a lot of that fell away, because it was really, well, yes, we agree on everything about it. Now we'll figure out the implementation details. And so it changed the tone and the direction of the conversations in a way that it made some of those sticking points fall away.
Hey, thanks, guys. If others have questions, hang on to them, because I want to move along a little bit. Oh, I should say, if somebody has a paramount objection, you can or if there are objections, you can also form teams or subgroups and to work on it. Doesn't have to sit solely on the shoulders of the person who's uncomfortable, but maybe somebody who's an advocate and somebody who's uncomfortable can work on a revised proposal. Okay, so Nicole, I'm going to ask you next to talk about what your experience has been at Western Idaho.
And Marie, if you have anything to add, jump in. So we, I think we started it off at the same time as Willamette. We brought it back with us. We're kind of the opposite problem is that we have a lot of change going on because we're working towards our initial accreditation. So we have a lot of things that were happening over the last 3 years. And there was a lot of different stuff going on. It was hard to keep track of it, hard to keep us moving forward. And we also had similar issues with, getting stuck in the mud is what we called it. We would get there and you would think that everybody either agreed with them or not, even if they weren't speaking up. And so by bringing dynamic governance back to us and doing the round table, it forced everyone to speak up so that the people who spoke the loudest now didn't believe that they were representing people who were afraid to speak up, which I think is really critical to how we've been moving forward with this. The biggest hesitation we had towards adopting dynamic governance was this paramount objection, because my group looked at it as it's set up that everything will pass and I will get no say, no way to veto. And I think our first proposal, one of the first ones that we put up was objected to and sent back. And so that really helped to do that within the same session as agreeing to use this, so that people were less afraid that it was just a way for, as department chair, for me to strong arm decisions through or something like that, which is a whole different conversation. So, so that's really where we were at. We struggled a little bit with what paramount objection, how paramount objection works, what it looks like, what it means to us. And I think as a group, we've decided on a little bit of a norm, but really we don't, there's rarely a paramount objection anymore, but mainly because I think the time frame is the number one thing that works well for us, is because there's that end point where we will revisit, it makes it so that it's less scary to everybody. So, and one thing that we've done, similarly, we jumped right in at basically 7A. A lot of our proposals come from individual faculty or from myself based on what the directions we're getting. One of the things that we've added, or I took away from the participation I had with the Pulse team last year, is the check-in, check-out rounds at the beginning of the meeting. My team was not excited about that, and Marie can probably speak to that too, because it was feely. We call it the feels round now. But actually by the end of the semester, they very much, they agreed to keep it going. We actually have agreed to continue doing it. We agree every semester we're going to continue with dynamic governance. And they actually really like that it focuses in on the meeting and it gets everybody kind of set in there. So Marie, did you have anything you wanted to add about how it's been working for us?
Not really. I do think it has allowed us to move forward pretty well, and it's opened up our whole department meetings for better discussions. I just kind of mirror what Nicole is saying, but certainly our discussions are better, and we're able to move forward and accomplish something. Yeah.
So I don't. Apparently, I'm not very loud, so I'm just going to speak louder. I don't know if that's going to help, but. I don't know if there's any questions about how we adopted it. We very similarly, it's been night and day for us. And I think that the biggest thing, especially as department chair for me, is the fact that everybody has to contribute to the conversation because we go round table. That way you at least get a sense. Even if they don't care, we all now see that we don't all care, and that's okay. Rather than people thinking that they're the champion for everybody.
Sorry, yes, I was muted. Any questions?
I have one brief question. This is Jim at Whitman College. Has anyone found that the sequence in which you tend to go around the group becomes important, that certain voices that come out first can influence whether someone will repeat or decide to put an opposing view out, whether or not the first 4 people all seem to agree, does that stifle how someone who might come later in the round might decide to voice an opinion?
So I'll just jump in. We, because we do that check-in, check-out round, we just happen to go in a specific order. It almost always works that we go from my left because I'm running the meeting. And so we always go in that order. It's throughout that meeting. So, you know, it kind of just sets the tone, and it always just round the table or round the Skype.
Okay.
So I would say at Willamette that we actually are making a pretty conscious effort to alternate the order in which we speak, start in different random spots.
Okay.
And not within the same meeting, like from meeting to meeting we switch, but within a meeting it goes in the same order over and over again. Did you want to say something about the timer?
Yeah, and we've actually adopted a timer mechanism so that the timer gets passed around, and that, you know, somebody doesn't spend 15 minutes for clarifying questions and somebody else spends 30. You get your, you know, your 2.5 minutes or whatever, and then the timer goes off and we just stop listening to you and it goes to the next.
That's pretty clever. Yeah, Pam?
I do think the order can be important, and that's one of the elected positions in the group is the facilitator. And so you do want to choose a facilitator that will sometimes mix it up, right? So you know, we don't always necessarily start with the first person first. And sometimes, you know, we don't always do it as formally either. We don't use a timer, but I could see how that might be helpful. But so sometimes, you know, if someone's being quiet, the facilitator needs to say, hey, let's check in with, you know, Tom or Gary or who's ever being quiet. Let's make sure. That can be important. So the order can be important. And so I think it's the role of the facilitator to sort of sense what's going on, and sometimes let one person start and a different, you know, in the same meeting, perhaps, you know, but if you have a process that's working within your group that everyone's happy with, you know, as long you can follow that as well. So there's flexibility in the process.
And as somebody who's fairly quiet, I really appreciate this because I know I'm going to get to weigh in without trying to figure out how I can squeeze in between those two people who are much more outspoken than I am. So I appreciate that. And I think once people develop some trust, they understand that expressing a reservation is okay with the group. I mean that. And it's part of an obligation to help the group dynamic to say, you know, I'm just not comfortable with this, and here's why. Because, you know, if you let it slide, then we all know it comes back to bite you eventually. Okay, I wanted to switch it over to Erica, who's going to talk about, suppose you're in a group and you haven't all decided that dynamic governance is the best thing since peach ice cream. Is there anything that you can learn from these principles to help you with the group dynamic?
All right. So one of the questions that Ariel asked was kind of the reason that I wanted to present this personal experience with you. This idea that you may not have a department that you can go back to and that immediately adopts dynamic governance. And that doesn't mean that you can't be implementing some of the underlying beliefs and actions of dynamic governance. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. I know that Gary sent this out to you ahead of time, but I just wanted to remind you that there's this website that talks about sociocracy, which is the underpinnings of dynamic governance. And in particular, there's a resource there that I found very useful, describing sociocracy for one. And so what this is empowering an individual to sort of choose from a menu of actions that align with the values of sociocracy and dynamic governance. And so you shouldn't be surprised by seeing some of these because they're echoed on the flow sheet that Pamela went through. But as an individual, you can set the stage by expecting consent, by initiating rounds where you can elicit ideas from everyone in the room, not just the most vocal, doing some of that double linking that we see in in organizations that's useful for crosstalk, assigning discussions, actively soliciting objections so that you get all ideas on the table again. And so what I wanted to spend just a few brief moments today was going through a real life example with you guys. And you know, maybe you wouldn't think that you would need sociocracy or dynamic governance for something like a lab group meeting where we're all working toward a common goal on a common project. But in this particular example that I have for you, this is a group of people working together across institutions and across time zones. And so it means that they're meeting in this sort of environment on Zoom. And it can be difficult to talk in a natural way and also to get everyone's ideas out on the table. So I'll just give you a second to read this in case you didn't have an opportunity to before coming in. So the idea here is that maybe Maria is feeling that that the whole breadth of ideas are not being brought to bear onto the research, and that perhaps this might be detrimental to the progress of the research group overall. And so I wanted to turn it back to you guys. Given what you've heard today and perhaps what you've reviewed on the website, what kind of ways might you leverage the ideas of sociocracy and dynamic governance to help Maria out? And now I can't see everyone. Now I can.
I have an idea. I guess it seems sometimes a person can be somewhat overwhelming. And I think by suggesting up front that everyone will just have a certain amount of time to present their ideas might be a way to make sure everybody is provided time to give input. The other thing is for the facilitator, maybe prior to the meeting, to pull the individual aside and point out that you would like them to be more of a listener this time, and you know, see if they could, you know, maybe give them a slightly different role. Ask them if they could maybe be extra careful with listening so that they can maybe pick up on other ideas that are presented, or try to give them a slightly different task so that they don't monopolize the conversation.
Okay. So creating space, two things you mentioned were creating space, making sure that everybody gets an opportunity to speak, and then perhaps having a conversation with that individual, inviting them to play more of a listening or supportive role in some of the meetings. Mm-hmm. Other ideas?
I think the simplest thing is just the rounds. It's so simple to do. I've seen our division chair, Jim Russo, try this out in a fractious meeting, and it did just that one tiny thing did change the tone immediately without the kind of intimidating need to bring up this entire governance structure that you're hoping to use.
Yeah, so even if you're not the facilitator that day, because you know sometimes in a lab group meeting you get together, somebody presents some data, a few people talk about the problems, what the next experiment should be, and before you know it, you're off and running onto a different experiment. And so anybody at that stage can say, whoa, can we just pause for a second and get a round of quick reactions from the group? Because I'm curious what other people are thinking. So it doesn't have to be the facilitator, it could be anybody that initiates those rounds. Great. Other ideas? So it might seem strange to set an agenda for a lab group meeting, especially if like it were an in-person one. Because I think generally we fall into a routine of how it's going to go with presenting and critiquing data. But you might consider actually floating an agenda ahead of time that says, I propose that we spend this much time talking about experiment 1 and experiment 2. And within that, make clear in your agenda the expectation that there's going to be feedback from everyone, but then asking at the beginning of your meeting for folks to reflect on the agenda and to consent to the agenda. Do we all agree that this is what we're here to accomplish today? Or do we think there are some other things that are more pressing? Maybe between the time that the agenda was sent out and the actual meeting, somebody has a new experiment that now there's some new insights that need to be brought to bear. And if it's somebody who's a little bit quieter, say a graduate student, it may be difficult for them to insert those ideas into the process. So for me, I'm struggling. I had been struggling with this professionally, in that I felt like some of the graduate students in our group weren't being able to share their ideas, and they had some really important insights into the research. And so I started doing the very informal, let's all quick check in. I want some quick reactions from everyone. But I also set an agenda for lab group that includes let's review our lab group notebook from last time. Do we consent to the minutes, meeting minutes? I don't call it that, but do we consent to what we discussed and agreed upon last time? And are there any ideas about whether or not the agenda for that day should be changed? And just those 3 things meant that Lee, there was nothing wrong with Lee. Lee wasn't being aggressive or anything, but it really sort of sent a message to the whole group that everyone's voices should be heard every time that we were meeting, because that's how good science was gonna be produced. So I think you can use it in most settings if you're really creative about it. And I agree with Ariel that rounds is sort of, it's empowering for the group.
Great. Any questions for Erica? Thanks, Erica. You're small on my screen, so I have to sort of squint a little to see if I see anybody with their hands up. I don't think so. So our last bit of this presentation is you don't only interact with your colleagues, there are other folks that you interact with in your profession, and including students. And so Cheryl's going to talk about a situation that she faced where she tried a little dynamic governancing with some students.
Thanks, Gary. So I teach a 3rd-year course in biology, and it's a lab-based course, and the students work together in groups to do a project. And most of the time, the students don't know each other. Sometimes they do. They can choose their own groups, but mostly it's just 2 sitting next to each other when we divide up the groups. And we actually spend some class time on group dynamics, how to set community guidelines, and how to respect other people in the group. And usually it works quite well. I do sort of a check-in with the groups, and I just, how's it going? If you want to talk to me, you can email me for a private discussion if things aren't going well. And usually there's maybe 1 group a year or something that has issues, and they're resolved fairly easily. This year, the morning before their first proposal presentation, a pretty big deal, one group member came to me and said she was very unhappy with her group. She felt she wasn't being heard, that there was a bully and a bully's accomplice and a whatever person. And so she was very dissatisfied. And of course, it's the morning of their proposal, not much you can do. And I said, well, let's see what happens, and we'll move forward after the presentation. Well, of course, it bombed totally. They didn't keep correct time, they left out parts, it was a real disaster. So it was clear that they needed a bit more intervention. And so I called a meeting of the group, and I told them a little bit about dynamic governance and the fact that we were going to have some basic rules, or playground rules, if you want to call them, and that these were going to be that they were going to have to take a turn, and that everybody had to speak once before anybody could speak twice, and that if somebody had a complaint, that was fine, but they had to provide an alternative. And so they couldn't just say, I don't like this. They had to say, this is what I propose. And so we did this, and as Stas said, what's the motivation for doing this? Well, the motivation was they knew they totally bombed their presentation, and they wanted to get a better mark the next time. They wanted to get out of this terrible situation the group was in. And so everybody got to speak, and I said, okay, I want you to tell me why you think this didn't work. What are the things that you felt were contributing? They all agreed that it was a disaster. So what do you think this was? And they all brought up pretty much the same things, that, you know, time crunch, that they weren't listening to each other, that two people were making decisions for the whole group. And so I said, okay, now let's go around again, and I want everybody to suggest one thing you could do to improve the way the group functions. And it was amazing. On their own, they came up with their new group guidelines that were essentially what dynamic governance is all about. And so the fact that they could propose something, there had to be a timeline in which the other group members had to respond, and they had to consent. They couldn't just not answer and imply consent. So they actually had to be accountable for what was going on in the group. And so that poor whatever person, he was no longer off the hook. He now had to contribute either by saying, I agree, or I propose this. And things really, really improved. They did amazingly well until push came to shove. The final project is due. And again, a group member came and said to me, you know, I don't think I'm being heard. And so I said, okay, let me talk to, because by then they had elected a corresponding author for their final paper who I spoke to. And I just said to her, okay, you know, what rules of the dynamic governance are not being held to? And she just said, well, you know, time is short. I can't wait for the 12 hours for everybody to get back to me. I said, okay, well, maybe it's the 12 hours that's the issue. Could you suggest something else? And she said, well, maybe if they could get back to me in 6 hours. And so I said, okay, you contact the group, say that you would like to make this change, ask for consent to make the change, and see what happens. Well, they went through this. I had no more complaints. The first proposal they did, they got one of the lowest marks in the class. Their final paper was absolutely one of the best. It was a shining example of good teamwork and good contributions from everybody, and I just think it really worked. Anybody have any questions or comments about this?
Yeah, a round of applause. It's amazing how much better the group dynamic gets if everybody feels like they have a chance to be heard.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think that's the genius of this, the dynamic governance or sociocracy, is that, you know, because you agree to it, and because there are sort of formal rules, as Jason was saying earlier, it's not one person's idea of what to do. It's just like, here's a tool that we can use to make sure that we engage everybody. And I think it works well. Certainly, there are close to 50 pretty strong-willed fellows of Pulse, and we use it. And I think it's been working pretty well. And we've occasionally hit some rough spots, and it's helped us through that. Where a group, for example, worked long and hard on a proposal, got lots of feedback, came forward to the whole group, and then some folks offered paramount objections at what seemed like the last minute, and things looked a little dicey. But in fact, the group took it in the right spirit. They talked to the folks who had objections. They thought about it some more. They went off. They revised the proposal. They brought it back, and it subsequently was adopted by consent. You know, that wouldn't necessarily have been my first reaction. It would have been to say something like, well, you had your chance already. Why are you doing this now? But I think they were more grown up than I would have been, and just said, okay, let's think about what would it take to make it acceptable to you. And so that really, for me, was the real acid test for this procedure. Yeah, sure.
Well, I think for me, a lot of it is just common sense, but you set some guidelines that you can formalize, and that that common sense can prevail when emotions get involved. And then that way you can always fall back on these very objective criteria. And you could just say, this is what you agreed on when heads were cool and logic prevailed. And let's just go back and see how we can revisit this from this very logical perspective. And for this particular group, it was a godsend. They never would have survived the term without killing each other or something. If something hadn't been done.
The head of that sociocracy for all group, who I've met, always says if things are getting dicey and and things are starting to spiral out of control, the first thing to do is just go around and ask everybody, give them a chance to speak and ask their opinion, and that can often, lower the temperature in the room enough that you can start to have a productive conversation. And Steve, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I just this might be stating the obvious, but just wanted to bring people back and applaud these wonderful examples of how system structure changes system behavior. And to relate that lesson to these various examples. And it's a powerful thing to think about. So well done, everyone.
Thanks. Any last, we're coming up on the hour and I promise to keep it less than that. So any last comments or questions that we can deal with?
Or any additional resources that you would be interested in having from us.
Yes. Good point.
So I have a question. It's really might be the wrong question for the end of the session, but why did the Pulse group adopt this dynamic governance versus other meeting models?
Well, that's a good question. And we were sort of thrown together haphazardly and had to assemble ourselves. And after about a year of getting to know each other, then we decided to keep the project going. And then we thought, well, at this point, we're going to have something a little more organized than the loose organization we had. And so we actually had a group look at some options. A sort of standard majority rules, Robert's Rules of Order kind of thing that you might be familiar with. That's in the way the faculty that I've been part of have organized themselves. But there were a couple of people. One was at a Quaker institution, and one was had been involved with a nonprofit where they used these sort of consensual or consent-based procedures. Dynamic governance has its roots in Quaker kind of meeting procedures. And so they floated that idea too, and we decided to give it a try. And we did it for a short period of time. In fact, it's up for reconsideration at our next All Fellows meeting. So we wanted to try it out and see if it works. And I think, generally agreed that it's been helpful for us, especially a group of people who didn't know each other very well to start with. It's really helped us develop a good relationship and a trusting relationship with one another. Yeah, Pam?
So it's interesting because all the things that we heard from the Willamette group and the group in Idaho, we had all of the same issues. We had the louder voices and the quieter voices. We had our meetings could sometimes be hijacked by a couple of folks who will remain nameless. And so, and the important thing is that all of us were used to being in charge. I'm going to go back to the last screen, the summary. And all of us had been, department chairs or deans or what have you. And so it's really this is really a model of distributive leadership. And all of the things that we've said, this was our summary slide, but all of these things emerge in our discussion today. And it builds trust in the group. And that's the most important part is building trust in the group. And the listening that was mentioned. And through time, it might not always be sort of your way, but you trust that your group has the true aims of at heart, and you know that progress is going to be made. And and as a person who has been in situations with Robert's Rules of Order, it's not the same. And I had never heard of this. They said sociocracy, and I was like, what the heck is that? And once we started doing it, I was like, man, this is awesome. So It was fortuitous, but I think it was been a fabulous experience from my perspective, at least.
Mine too. And and there were some, folks who thought it seemed a little touchy-feely for a scientist to be doing this kind of thing. But they were willing to go along with it. And I think pretty much folks are now on board and see the value of it. I think that's we are scientists and we do see, this is working pretty well and it works better than some of the other groups that I've been part of. So we like it. I should thank you all for taking the time, taking an hour. I should let you know that we're planning to do 2 other webinars in the spring. And based on the feedback that we got for the suggestions of what the topics might be, they're going to be on curriculum mapping and on concept inventories, using concept inventories. So probably somewhere around the end of January, beginning of February, and then into March, we'll be firming those dates up with you and getting back in touch. If all went well, Bill has recorded this. And so I know a number of people couldn't make it, or if you have colleagues who couldn't make it, who you think might be interested in it, we'll be getting those posted and letting you know where to find the information. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Any last comments? If not, enjoy the rest of the day and your holiday. And we hope to see you next year. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Have a good holiday.
Happy holiday.
Happy New Year.